Hi, I'm Bram, and ever since I was a child, I've loved going to the zoo. Having grown up in Amsterdam for the first 4 years of my life, I could be finding the local zoo artists so often that when I returned there a good decade later, I could still pretty much find my way around without having to look at any of the signs. While it's impossible to say for certain how my earliest ideas formed themselves, I think zoos had some impact on how I came to my views regarding animals and nature, and without them, I might not have decided at the age of 10 that I wanted to become a vegetarian, eventually getting my parents to join me. It shouldn't then come as much of a surprise that Zoo Tycoon and its sequel Zoo Tycoon 2 were among my favorite games as a child, especially Zoo Tycoon 2. Whereas the first game took this isometric top-down perspective on a bunch of pixelated animals that were really hard to identify with, the second game, from my point of view, put me in this photorealistic first-person view from which I could see all of the animals up close, so that I could really pretend I was an actual zookeeper standing face-to-face with some of my favorite animals. Okay, I did say from my point of view, alright? I realize it doesn't exactly measure up to my memories now. Anyway, as time has gone on, my relationship with zoos has shifted a bit. I still like going to them because I still really like animals, but for that very same reason, visiting the zoo has started to feel more and more uncomfortable. My relationship to the Zoo Tycoon games has, likewise, shifted because of all this. So let's dive into that, and explore my complicated relationship with Zoo Tycoon. Walking around the zoo a lot, at a certain point, you really can't help but wonder how ethical all of it really is. Can you really offer an animal a full life in captivity? Is it ethical at all for animals to exist only for the amusement and financial gain of humans? Maybe asking questions like that overly anthropomorphizes animals, but experts of animal behavior have pointed to certain repetitive behaviors that animals often exhibit in captivity as signs of stress or understimulation. Researchers have observed this phenomenon often enough that it has been given a name: zoochosis. Animal species evolve to live in a very specific set of circumstances, and as a result of that, need a certain amount of space and stimulation to live in a way that suits them. For many animals, these circumstances simply can't be replicated in a zoo environment. There's really no way to stimulate elephants' natural life of trekking for miles upon miles, for instance, and prey animals are often severely understimulated in an environment without predators. And this is all assuming that zoos do their best to mimic the natural circumstances of animals as best they could, which they certainly very often don't. Even as a child, I remember being disturbed by the outrageously small cages of the big cats at Artis. There's pretty much always a financial incentive here, after all, which does usually push zoos into cramming just a little too many animals into the space that they have available. It should come as no surprise then that many animals display wildly different behavior in captivity than they do in the wild, like endlessly pacing around in circles or even killing their own offspring, and some species, like elephants, have their life expectancy cut by decades when living in captivity. There's even the occasional horror story about a zoo animal purposely ending its own life. Things like that do keep gnawing at the back of my mind while I'm watching a bear endlessly walking in circles in its enclosure. I can't help but also think about this when playing Zoo Tycoon. I do know, of course, that these are not real animals, as much as the hyper-realistic graphics sometimes make it easy to forget that. I know that it's impossible to create any real-world suffering simply by building this virtual zoo, but the game just reminds you so much of the less ethical aspects of zookeeping in so many subtle ways that it's hard not to let my mind drift to those real-world issues on occasion. Animal welfare is actually a major mechanic in both Zoo Tycoon 1 and 2. Recreating the natural environment of an animal, providing it shelter, stimulation, the correct food, enough space, determine how happy your animals are, and happy animals improve your zoo's rating and your visitors' experiences. This emphasis on animal well-being at first might seem like a good thing, but the way it's implemented, it really just serves to whitewash the reputation of actual zoos that don't do nearly enough in this regard. The game tells you in no uncertain terms that all these animal species can't just be happy in captivity, which is already untrue for many of them, but also that this happiness can be achieved way easier than is actually true. Enclosure sizes and stimulation levels that would leave real animals either completely bored out of their minds or perpetually anxious are treated as the high watermark of animal satisfaction. The game also implies a tie between animal happiness and visitor satisfaction, as well as financial performance of a zoo, which... is there really a causal relationship there? Sure, if visitors could tell that animals were unhappy, that might put them off from visiting again, but real people are not nearly as good at reading animal behavior as these virtual guests. As the continued existence of many zoos can attest to, many people can't really recognize bad conditions for animals if they don't take the form of comically small cages. And while people often think they can tell exactly how an animal is feeling, that's usually just a whole lot of projection. Just as the woman who thought she had a deep personal connection with Bukito, a gorilla in Blijdorp Zoo in Rotterdam, who was actually interpreting her prolonged eye contact with the animal as a sign of aggression and attacked the woman when she managed to leap out of his enclosure. All this is to say that it's a lot easier to run a zoo that seems ethical than one that actually is. And when zoos are, at least in part, businesses run for profit... I mean, the game is called Zoo Tycoon. Animal abuse does not result in a game over, whereas bankruptcy does. Okay, I didn't know where to put this bit, but I suppose it relates to animal well-being, so here goes. Zoos regularly just kill their animals. Just kill them dead. Which sort of makes a twisted kind of sense. There's only a limited amount of space in zoos around the world for certain species, and when your enclosures get overcrowded, you're gonna have to do something. But the idea that we're putting wild animals in enclosures where they're perpetually anxious and or understimulated, only to eventually shoot them because we collected too many of them, really does put the sanity of the whole enterprise into question. When visiting a modern-day zoo, at least where I live, it's impossible not to notice how the world's actual zoo tycoons justify the existence of their ventures. It's hard to miss all the signs about which animals are endangered in the wild, the little plaques that helpfully let you know all the ways in which this particular zoo is helping preserve wildlife around the world, and the donation boxes strewn around the park that allow visitors to make their own contribution to wildlife preservation. This goes for the Zoo Tycoon games as well. In both 1 and 2, animals can be released into the wild rather than selling them when you don't have space for them anymore. I know this because as a child I couldn't bear seeing my animals die, so I would release them into the wild before they had the chance to, so I could pretend they were still happy and alive in the wild. I would hate to shatter the illusions of my younger self, but yeah, that's not how it works. The vast majority of animals raised in captivity simply lack the skills and knowledge to survive in the wild. There are some success stories here, but those only justify the keeping of a handful of species that zoos keep, and pretty much none of the ones that people actually come to see. Then there's the idea that even when these animals might never be able to be released into the wild, zoos can at least facilitate breeding between these animals, some of which are highly endangered. That way we can ensure a population of these animals survives, even if their wild counterparts die out, so the species would not be entirely lost. This, again, is an idea that the Zoo Tycoon games very much play into. As I said, it's very easy to make your animals happy in Zoo Tycoon, and as long as animals are happy, they are guaranteed to procreate. These games make it seem like a foregone conclusion that zoos, at least good zoos, are a huge help to breeding programs of endangered species. Which could hardly be further from the truth. Breeding wild animals in captivity is, for most species, way harder than it is in places like, say, actual wildlife preserves. Turns out that when you place an animal in an environment that it's completely unsuited for, most of them don't get around to... choking the chicken? Flogging the dolphin? No, those are masturbation. Something about doggy? You catch my drift, they're not in the mood. In the grander scheme of breeding programs, zoos really only play a very marginal role, if any. Certainly not nearly enough to justify their existence. Zoo populations also tend to be pretty inbred, so you wouldn't exactly be preserving a very representative image of the animal's wild population anyway. Of course, many zoos also donate a portion of their revenue to wildlife preservation, which might seem significant, but is usually only a very small amount that's mostly good for reputation laundering. I hope it goes without saying that if you want to donate to wildlife preservation projects, you can just donate to wildlife preservation projects. Zoos arguably encourage that by often having donation boxes strewn around the park, the proceeds of which go to such organizations, but come on, give me a break. When do people ever put more into that than maybe the single coin that a toddler really insists on throwing into that thing? Those things are obviously there for the optics. In that light, it's kind of funny how Zoo Tycoon handles such donation boxes, because the proceeds of those go directly back into your zoo's pockets. At least there, the game is putting up no illusions. So yeah, all in all, when it comes to animal conservation, zoos really don't do much good. In the end, it's really just image control, and I think it's pretty telling that zoos know how much they have to project this image of themselves as part of the fight to save endangered species. Another big argument that's often trotted out when the existence of zoos is questioned is the educational argument. Zoos will get more people interested in animals, especially when visiting them at a young age that children often do, which will cause them to want to learn about nature and about the world and turn them into more responsible world citizens with regard for nature. The Zoo Tycoon series leans pretty hard into the education angle as well. All the animals come with little bios that you can read to learn more about your favorite animals, and as a way of entertaining your guests, you can put things like animal museums in your park and hire educators who will tell people interesting facts about nature. This argument is hard to concretely prove or disprove. As I said, zoos certainly started my love of animals and put me on the path to environmentalism. I think? Again, I can't actually think back to when I was 2 years old and trace the origins of my love for animals to its source. Maybe it was the zoo, but maybe it was mainly our house cats, or seeing animals on TV, or just a natural way that most children relate to other sentient beings until they're taught not to, or at least be very selective about it. Most likely, it's a combination of many different influences, with zoos being far from essential. Zoo Tycoon itself probably played a part, which I suppose zoos as a concept get some credit for that game existing, but that's still no reason to keep them around in the future. When it comes to the effect zoos have on educating adults about things, we have some more concrete data to pull from, which doesn't paint a very rosy picture of the educational value of zoos. According to a survey from the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums from 2014, there seems to be some small positive effect zoos have on things like recycling, diet choices, and more ethical consumption of goods, something that famously exists under capitalism. While not meaningless, we're talking about single-digit percentages. Also, keep in mind that this is a survey that measures the self-reported level of importance with which people view these actions as a way to help save animal species, not any kind of objective measurement of the degree to which they're actually putting that into effect. And here comes the kicker. This same study actually shows zoos having a negative effect on people's perception of the importance of habitat protection. And this was all conducted and published by an interest group that represents zoos. So if there's any bias here, it's probably in favor of zoos. So yeah, as an educational tool for adults, zoos have at best a very modest, and at worst a net negative effect. The last big idea that is somewhat commonly presented in defense of zoos is the idea that animals are these incredible empathy machines. They invite us to identify with animals, creatures that are in many ways pretty dissimilar to us, which should make us better at empathizing in general. There's this prevalent idea of a circle of empathy that starts with ourselves and can be expanded outward to things that are less and less similar to this. By this logic, extending that circle of empathy automatically makes us more empathetic towards our fellow humans, which... Does it? Does it really? One only needs to create a Twitter or Facebook account, not necessarily a recommendation, to find scores of people who are more than willing to sympathize with sad abandoned doggies, lions shot by dentists, and cats tragically caught in war zones, but who won't even extend an ounce of empathy towards refugees, even children, fleeing those same war-torn countries. The idea that empathy for animals is this cure-all for people's lack of empathy is laughably childish, and very easily countered by reality. Empathy for one animal doesn't even guarantee empathy for another very similar animal, as most people would shudder at the idea of eating a tapir who wouldn't bat an eye at eating a pig. If there's one thing humans are good at, it's selectively shutting off empathy when it suits us. As long as we're not directly witnessing suffering by animals, or humans for that matter, we're shockingly good at closing ourselves off to it, regardless of how much empathy we can muster for other groups of creatures. So no, this argument doesn't do much to persuade me. Even if there is some positive effect that empathizing with animals has on general empathy, there's no reason to assume that zoos are necessary for that. A seagull or pigeon is just as far removed from us as a penguin or an ostrich, and a cat is no more human than a lion. Nature documentaries, moreover, in some sense allow you to get much closer to animals, and zoos don't have the empathetic aid of David Attenborough stringing a narrative about some poor animal's search for their mother over unrelated footage of 7 different penguins. Hell, Zoo Tycoon 2 itself was enough to get me as a kid to empathize with not just animals, but even with only mildly convincing polygonal representations of them. In short, I find it hard to see what kind of aid towards empathy zoos may provide that cannot also be found in other, less morally dubious places. So, what do I actually want to say with all this? Well, let's start with what I definitely do not want to say. I am not saying that you should quit playing Zoo Tycoon. As I said, these are not real animals. It's impossible to cause any actual harm by playing these games. This video is explicitly not about moralizing any enjoyment you may derive from this piece of media. There is some argument to be made that monetarily supporting the creation of these games is helping to run defense for the zoo industry, but yeah, even I think that one's a stretch. And it's not like Microsoft is making it all that easy these days to enjoy these games in a way that made Microsoft any money. I guess what I really want to make sure is that you don't take the game's normalizing of zoos at face value. After all, it took very little effort to turn this into this. When it comes to real-world zoos, what I guess I'm saying is their existence is not really very defensible, is all I'm sure about. That is not to say that there couldn't be a kind of zoo that is more morally defensible, like one that focuses on animals that can actually be kept in captivity without any negative effect on their health or well-being, and or animals for which it is actually a good way to strengthen the wild population, but I'm not sure such a zoo currently exists. Maybe they do, but I haven't been to them, and they certainly don't justify the existence of any of the others. If I'm calling on you, the viewer, to do anything, it's to maybe not visit zoos? I'm not sure that even I myself will follow that advice, but at least don't mistake it for the act of wildlife preservation that zoos want you to think it is. Maybe Zoo Tycoon can actually be of help here. The next time I'm tempted to go to a zoo, I know what I'm gonna boot up instead. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, like, subscribe, ring the bell, watch another one, yada yada, you know the spiel. But also please actually do those things, it does really determine my video's chances of success. Okay, bye.